Hi, I'm John Ruggie. This is a panel on innovation and adaptation of multilateral institutions in a new geopolitical era. We have a cast of thousands. We have 6 papers, we had 2 commentators, but I decided that given that it's late Friday, we'd only have 1, and I have bestowed the honor on Mark Raymond, who will pull it all together. So the idea here is simply to raise questions about what adaptations have there been and what adaptations should there be in various multilateral mechanisms responding to global challenges ranging from security to public health to economic development. And the papers do that faithfully. I've tried to suggest to our presenters an order of presentation that seems semi-rational, given the diversity of topics. So we're going to start with Mikhail Troitskiy talking about the BRICS approaches to security multilateralism. And then I'll ask Hampson to address the co-authored paper on informal collective conflict management systems. Then Domenico Lombardi talking about is the World Bank's approach to risk management fit for purpose? I think that's the way to describe it. James Orbinski will talk about innovations actual and desirable in global health governance. John Ravenhill will talk about the pluses and minuses of global value chains and how the challenges global value chains pose relate to what multilateral institutions, economic institutions do. And then finally, Mira Burri will talk about internet-induced changes in global governance. And I've asked each of the presenters to limit themselves to about 8 minutes so that we can actually have a discussion when it's all said and done. So without further ado, Mikhail, please.
Thank you, Professor Ruggie. An honor to be here on this panel. So let me just launch my PowerPoint and I'll begin. So my paper is titled BRICS Approaches to Security Multilateralism, and I'm using this, the term approaches in the plural to emphasize that the views of BRICS members on the goals and procedures of multilateral security cooperation significantly vary. And I'll go through my argument quickly given the time constraints, the severe time constraints just set by the chairman. So now BRICS is essentially a group of countries that are too weak to lead and too strong to follow. Too weak to lead means that none of the BRICS countries champions a global cause to which other BRICS partners can be harnessed. And BRICS nations generally lack the appeal and financial clout to rally global coalitions under their flags. Their foreign policy and security concerns and aspirations are largely focused on their respective neighborhoods. And too strong to follow means that the BRICS cherish their freedom of maneuver on the world stage, so they don't want to commit to firm rules of alliance behavior, at least in the long run, especially if the alliance involves a peer nation, and particularly the United States of America. So BRICS nations do not engage in security multilateralism if that implies joining a stable alliance with a peer nation or a stronger nation. Neither do BRICS jointly promote positive security agendas, that is, strategies aimed at increasing absolute gains for the whole international community or large segments of the international community. So the only possible avenue for security multilateralism with participation of BRICS countries seems to be an attempt to collectively balance the developed nations. Now, in my paper, I offer a classification of the whole variety of BRICS reactions to what can be called, to what I call security innovation by the West. And I do that on this two-dimensional chart And to make the task manageable in this convention paper, I only look at the reactions of 3 BRICS members, China, Russia, and India. So the types of challenges are listed here along the vertical axis. And these are the challenges of advanced technology, of conflict management, and doctrine innovation. What the technology challenge in the field of security consists of is pretty clear, I guess. It's about high-precision weapons, potential space weapons, missile defenses, and so forth. Now, the conflict management challenge derives from armed intervention by the West into internal conflicts to support a party that some BRICS nation, for example, Russia, doesn't want to win. And the doctrine challenge is about the notions of internationalist solidarity with suffering populations of foreign countries and about R2P. And then China, India, and Russia react to those challenges in 4 different ways. They can undertake asymmetric measures to offset the West's advantage. They can seek to impose legal constraints on the undesired trend, on the undesired innovation aspect. They can try to match or to mirror the advantage of the West by developing similar technologies and applying similar doctrines, and that's the third possible response. And finally, they can choose to cooperate with the West in an area of concern. And examples of each type of response to each challenge are presented on the slide. I will not go into that right now, given the time limits. Now, often the overall response by a BRICS nation to a certain challenge combines all or several of those aspects, but still one aspect, one component will usually be dominant in that response. Now, having classified the whole variety of reactions by BRICS to the advancement of the West in a number of areas, my paper looks at the possibility of China, Russia, and India actually agreeing on and implementing a concerted, a coordinated response to the undesired strategy and or doctrine innovation by the West. A useful background against which we can trace the evolution of Chinese, Indian, and Russian responses is the perception that we are now entering a post-Western world. And this feeling of decline of the West is widespread in Moscow, Beijing, and New Delhi, and this feeling constitutes one of the core premises on which these 3 nations base their security policies, including attempts at multilateral cooperation. And here we find that the 3 BRICS players are on different trajectories when it comes to their responses to the supposedly declining West. Just a few examples to illustrate my point before I wrap up. Over the last few years, Russia has oscillated between cooperating with the West and taking frontally on US positions in post-Soviet Eurasia, as the crisis around Crimea has just demonstrated. And Russia has been clear that it aspires to nothing less than a major rewrite of the post-Cold War rules of the game, at least in Russia's own neighborhood. And the talk of a divided nation and the bid to protect compatriots anywhere in the world matched by military force is quite a dramatic move against the status quo that the West would be inclined to protect at this moment. And for China, this might really be too much. As we have seen, as we saw yesterday, Beijing has abstained in the UN Security Council and then the General Assembly when votes were held on Russia's actions in Crimea. And China was not among the 11 countries that supported the Russian case in the General Assembly yesterday. It also abstained. And there are early examples of the same kind. So for the moment, China does not aspire for the major overhaul of the rules of the game in Eurasia. Beijing only seeks to give an asymmetric response to American power on the Pacific and also to incrementally push the boundaries of international law especially the maritime law. And finally, India is even less inclined to rewrite the rules, except maybe in the field of non-proliferation. But even there, India sees the benefit of simultaneous cooperation with the United States and Russia. And India's main concern during the ongoing crisis around Ukraine seems to be that the Indian politicians fear that China might feel emboldened to expand its sphere of influence at India's expense, as one Indian observer just put it. So the conclusion is that there's enough daylight between the current postures and strategies of China, Russia, and India, so that well-coordinated multilateral action by them to balance the West seems unlikely, and it is even more unlikely if we consider all 5 BRICS nations. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So far, this is you get the prize for the best line I've heard at this ISA conference. Too weak to lead and too strong to follow. Congratulations, and thank you for staying on time.
Thank you.
Fan, tell us about the piccolo, the trumpet, and the bass fiddle. That may be the best title. So what does it mean?
Thanks. The paper that I've written with Chet Crocker and Pamela All addresses a simple question: what is the nature of international cooperation in the conflict management space to address the world's current and emerging security challenges? And just to lay some definitions on the table, conflict management in the paper is defined broadly, not narrowly. It's defined broadly as the use of both soft and hard power instruments to address traditional and non-traditional security threats with the aim of eventually putting in place governance mechanisms to prevent, manage, control, contain, or eventually resolve conflict. The tools of conflict management involve diplomatic, legal, judicial, policing, and economic instruments that are often used in conjunction with military power. Now, observers have come up with a variety of different labels to describe the current world. In Richard Haas's descriptive phrase, it's a world of messy multilateralism. U.S. leadership is diminished. The U.S. cannot handle world security challenges by itself. There is no stable security equilibrium in terms of the suppliers of hard and soft power tools. Some are stepping up to the plate, but many are not. Others, and we've certainly seen it in the large number of panels at this conference on regionalism, others are pointing to a resurgence of regionalism as local actors and regional security institutions play an increasingly important role in managing security challenges within their own geographical space. In the global security narrative, I think it's fair to say there's general recognition that global international institutions are returning to Cold War gridlock. Resources in the aftermath of the global fiscal crisis are shrinking. Threats are multiple and differentiated. Security is divisible, all of which is making cooperation more difficult. Our observation in the paper, and it is an observation, not a casual one, I might add, but one that is based on empirical observation, is that the world is seeing a new approach to conflict and security management, where multiple actors at the global, regional, national, and subnational levels band together in opportunistic, informal, loose associations to manage security challenges and devise new governance arrangements. We call this collective conflict management, CCM. Such arrangements do not involve enduring relationships among collaborating partners. They can be ad hoc, or they can be part of a collective mission statement. But it's important to note that cooperation is not treaty-based, as in formal arrangements like collective security or collective defense. Membership can also involve official and non-official actors. Cooperation, to go back to Richard's notion of messy multilateralism, is footloose, but it's not entirely fancy-free. The paper discusses 3 examples of CCM, collective efforts by NATO, EU, African sub-regional organizations, Kenya, Interpol, BIMCO, and even local communities in Somalia to combat piracy off the Horn of Africa, collective mediation and negotiation efforts to end the war in Philippines, Mindanao, and collective efforts to promote transitional justice and prosecute those charged with war crimes in Sierra Leone. I'm not going to say any more about the cases. You can read the paper. The goal in all of these undertakings was not only security stabilization, but also the promotion of new governance arrangements and strengthened institutions at the local level. CCM is neither good nor bad. It sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't. The interesting question, and it's one that we pose in the paper, is why do actors and institutions do it? And we argue it's motivated by organizational or sometimes national interests of those who do it, recognition that CCM participants have limitations in terms of their respective capacities, mandates, and reach, but there's strength in numbers. CCM participants, importantly, don't want to own the problem, but they also don't want to pass the buck. There are low barriers to engagement and relatively low transaction costs to cooperation, but also low exit costs if things go badly. The parties to CCM also don't want to create new institutions or to sign a treaty to do it. The activity they engage in sometimes makes the participants nervous because they lack formal authorization, but in many instances they just bloody well want to do it. Cooperation in CCM ventures is differentiated by threat, region, and different constellation of actors and institutions. And I think the next step, if we do more work on it, is to develop a typology that describes CCM by sector and by type, but that's all I will say. Thank you.
Thank you, friend. So, Domenico, tell us what's wrong with the World Bank and how we fix it.
Thank you, John. I'm going to present this very preliminary work that is jointly with Mary Woods of Oxford and CIGI and Kevin English of CIGI. Essentially, just let me give you first a couple of words in terms of what motivated this project. Essentially, the idea is, as you mentioned, John, at the outset, is really to assess World Bank risk management practices. And this is something that we have not really seen in the literature so far. And more specifically, whether the risk management practices at the World Bank may have become increasingly conservative over time, up to the point of constraining the development capability of the bank. So just to illustrate, the background to this, if you look at the yellow solid line, this is the net financial flows of the World Bank. And you see that there is a spike in the first half of the 80s, and then this line dwindles. It turns even negative in the first few years of the 2000s. There is a later spike at the height of the great financial crisis, but then it's going to fade again because the World Bank is going to return to the pre-lending levels before the crisis. If we look at the ratings, of course, the World Bank is a AAA rated, but there are also a number of multilateral banks which are AAA rated. What we found out by digging up a little bit more is that actually the World Bank, the IBRD, together with the ADB, are the only multilateral banks with an SACP of AAA. Essentially, this is really the highest rating based on the quality of the non-paid-in capital. In other words, the Standard & Poor's does bet on the fact that member states will be bailing the World Bank out should the financial position deteriorate. And of course, this is not to say that the World Bank shouldn't be AAA, but what we do notice is that even within the range of AAA multilateral banks, the IBRD is really at the highest, and that may not necessarily be a very efficient choice for the borrowers. Again, digging up a little bit more on how Standard & Poor's computes the AAA rating of multilateral development banks, we see that the IBRD has the highest capital ratio. That's the yellow bar. And even when this is adjusted, that's the green bar, again, the risk-adjusted capital ratio of the IBRD comes really as the highest. Again, the IBRD could still afford to keep the AAA rating by being a little bit less efficient. More efficient. And so if we look at, so we have seen that the IBRD has a fundamental sound financial position, but who really pays for this soundness of its in its financial position? So we have looked at essentially the the various components, the two components of usable equity. That's unrestricted paid-in capital and retained earnings. And if you look at the light blue bars, clearly these are rising over time, which essentially means that the bulk of the usable equity by the World Bank is provided by borrowers. So we have gone back and looked at, what was the original idea that the founding fathers had developed for the World Bank. And there is absolutely no doubt that, the ability to bear risk, the ability to share risks across the shareholding, the sovereign shareholding base was really the key driving factor, as I think this statement by Harry White before the US Congress clearly points out. Actually, White wanted the World Bank to have a larger capital base, wanted the World Bank to have a higher paid-in share, but what we did see is that from the start, when negotiations unfolded, essentially this risk aversion became to emerge. Then, of course, the World Bank management prioritized the AAA rating in the first phase of the bank's history. Once it secured its standing on financial markets, could afford to be a little bit more flexible in terms of fees, lending spreads, grace periods, and so on. Even when, in the late 70s, early 80s, there was some interest rate turbulence. It is really with the 90s that there is an emergence of a non-financial risk. The World Bank started to become more sort of risk averse. And this is clearly not an assessment on environmental safeguards, social safeguards, or financial management per se. But what we did see from the evidence from its own independent evaluation group material, what we did see through a number of interviews was essentially a bias, an emerging bias towards risk minimization rather than risk optimization, really a tendency to move away from a risk-based approach that has been exemplified in a number of independent evaluations. So all in all, and I'm wrapping up, so the analysis and the evidence we have surveyed so far does seem to suggest that the bank has become indeed increasingly risk-averse over the years, both in terms of financial risks, but also non-financial risks. And clearly, one of the questions that this raises, and to be frank, as I said, this is still work in progress, one of the questions that this raises, and we are still grappling with, is to what extent this risk adversity has been, risk aversion has really been driven by the preferences of some major shareholders, or the preferences of the institution itself as a bureaucracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Domenico. James, tell us about global public health governance and what you see there.
Well, thank you, John. Essentially, what I argue in my paper is that global public health today is struggling to emerge from a Westphalian conceptual trap that essentially sees discrete sovereign nations that properly secured can remain impermeable and impervious to threats and considerations that others may suffer or seek to impose on them. I argue that public health as a discipline and as a practice essentially emerged in the Industrial Revolution and particularly in the late phases of the Industrial Revolution as a social justice issue. And from that social movement, a profession, a discipline, and a practice of public health emerged that led to a series of interactions between states that allowed states in 1851 to reach their first agreement on interstate practice around disease containment, control, and mitigation. Prior to that time, disease, the spread of disease, especially communicable disease, yellow fever, cholera, plague, had been managed through state quarantine. From 1851 and for the next 100 years, a whole series of cooperative agreements emerged between states that focused on largely communicable diseases, but also on opium, alcohol, occupational health and safety, and transborder pollution. With the Cold War, the emergence of the Cold War, it was a bipolar world, and in that bipolar context, global health essentially went into a quiescent phase where the World Health Organization and its various affiliated institutions dipped in their salience and in their relevance to global governance as a whole. Global health issues themselves did not, in fact, significantly advance during that period. However, with the end of the Cold War, there was then a unipolar world, and that essentially sparked what some have described as a global health revolution. And with that revolution, from roughly 1990 to roughly 2008, in fact, particularly marked by the international financial crisis in 2008, there were a number of major changes, largely brought on by a myriad of actors, old and new, but certainly more prevalent and more capable in terms of engaging internationally. Those actors include, of course, states, their various ministries of health, international government organizations, the United Nations, the World Bank, IMF, the World Trade Organization, and then a myriad of NGOs characterized as international NGOs, bingos, business-oriented non-government organizations, lingos, little NGOs, longos, labor-oriented NGOs, foundations, most notably the Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, at least 25 new public-private partnerships focused on diagnostics, vaccines, and drugs, major philanthropists like George Soros, and major one-man states like Bono. Other major actors included multinational corporations, largely the pharmaceutical industry, and largely those industries focused on health services. In that period of time, a whole series of changes took place. The Millennium Development Goals were formulated. Global health reached a new peak in terms of its normative value in global governance. Global health appeared on agendas for the G8, the G20, in UN4, the WTO, and so on. There were 5 new conventions: a convention on tobacco control, health regulation, recruitment of health personnel, virus sharing, and the 5th one I can't remember. There were also major changes, and probably the single most important change was new institutions, UNAIDS, Global Fund for HTB and Malaria, and UNCTAD. This had material impact largely in terms of infectious diseases and most specifically in terms of AIDS, TB, and malaria. I argue in the paper that this process was driven in a dialectic relationship between forces from below relative to legitimate and authoritative forces from above. I argue in the paper that despite the normative rhetoric that surrounds transnational civil society organizations, in fact, the major changes were driven by foreign policy considerations that saw communicable diseases, particularly AIDS, TB, and malaria, and bioterrorism as threats to state security, and that in fact states co-opted global health ideas and material benefits as a means of establishing and using soft power to achieve their other ends. With the international financial crisis, there were enormous changes that were both newly evident and exacerbated. Those changes have had enormous impacts on health. And those changes are largely structural in nature. And the single largest and most significant determinant of health are not, in fact, things like infectious diseases, but in fact, the societal determinants of health. In terms of governance, there are a number of significant analyses that have looked at governance issues around global health. I won't go into them in detail. There's two that I will comment on. One describes governance mechanisms as a series of concentric power relations. There are problems with this. This model does not account for surprises that are game changers, and there are many surprises that are game changers in terms of governance. A second model proposes a new social contract for global health governance, but this unfortunately suffers from an excessive reliance on normative argument as a means of change. Normative argument is important, but it's certainly not sufficient to advance change. I focus in the paper on a newly released Commission on Global Governance for Health. This is released just 2 months ago by The Lancet. It's a combined effort of the Lancet, which is the leading medical journal in the world, Harvard University and Oslo University. And essentially, what it does is it doesn't simply describe a how or a what for global health governance. It in the first instance, describes a why. It argues that in the face of global crises driven by the international financial crisis and its ongoing effects, food crisis, fuel crisis, crisis in emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, and also most significantly climate change, that we need to be very clear about why we need better global health governance. And their argument essentially is that by focusing on the power relations between institutions, we can achieve greater health equity and better health outcomes for the majority of the world's poor. It proposes a very simple set of interventions. And I think, in fact, these are very powerful because of their simplicity, and they also account very significantly for the political reality of a post-Western, I suppose now is the new descriptor, a post-Western global context. Essentially, what it argues for is a multi-stakeholder platform on global governance for health, which would serve as a policy forum to provide space for diverse stakeholders to reframe issues, to set agendas, and to examine and debate policy issues. It also calls for an independent monitoring of how global governance processes affect health equity, and that these should be institutionalized through an independent scientific monitoring panel that's mandated to do health equity impact assessments across international organizations. And finally, it calls for existing measures to be used to better harness the global political determinants of health, strengthened use of human rights instruments for health, such as special rapporteurs, and stronger sanctions against a broader range against a broader range of violations by non-state actors through the international judicial system. This is, I think, a very simple and yet, again, very powerful set of proposals, because in the first instance, it appropriately accounts for the legitimate power structures that exist internationally, and it also appropriately accounts for the influence, very powerful influence of non-state actors in a dialectic relationship with those formal sources of power, and it also accounts for the necessary a necessary understanding of the dynamics of power and a necessary acceptance that in some circumstances power choices must make priorities other than those associated with health. For example, state security, development objectives, economic stability, and so on. However, by proposing that health issues and health equity issues be integrated across existing systems and that a new multi-stakeholder platform on global governance for health be established and that an independent scientific monitoring panel be established, I think these governance reforms are actually viable and doable. Final point, in a process of addressing global health governance, it's not simply about what global health practitioners and experts bring to the table, it's also about what they can learn. It's very clear that in, particularly since the end of the Cold War, and now most especially in a multipolar world, it's very clear that knowledge will continue to be a key force in shaping global health. That science delivers that knowledge, the science that delivers that knowledge will have to pay, the science that delivers that knowledge will have to pay far more attention to the local context in the future, and that grand technical solutions divorced from country realities will fail. And that health leaders will not be able to deliver success alone. They need political skills and they need political allies. And this, unfortunately, has eluded most health practitioners for the last 25 to 30 years. And finally, although health itself as both an indicator and an outcome of politics writ large is critical, it's also important that it be seen as a component of two more important human goals, which are well-being, or our capacity to actually function, and finally, agency, or our capacity to achieve whatever it is that we decide to achieve. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, James, for a terrific synthesis of a rapidly evolving area. I guess I would only wish everyone luck who's trying to escape the Westphalian trap through intergovernmental mechanisms, which are part of the Westphalian trap, but maybe we can come back to that in discussion. John Ravenhill is addressing the issue of global value chains, which managed to escape the Westphalian trap very nicely.
Indeed.
For their own purposes. So please tell us about the pluses and the minuses of that.
Okay, thank you, John. And when I wrote this paper, John was originally supposed to be one of the discussants, and so I thought I would try and win a brownie point by getting a reference to John's work on the post-Westphalian system into my first paragraph. So,
I noticed that, thank you.
Yeah, so it must be worth at least 10 seconds extra for the presentation, I hope. So, in his classical article, John noticed that the significance of offshoring in promoting transitions to postmodern forms of configuring political space, that this was well underway in the 1990s. In the succeeding 2 decades, the significance of what are now usually referred to as global value chains has grown exponentially. In the words of the WTO's former Director General, Pascal Lamy, they have produced a, quote, new paradigm where products are nowadays, quote, made in the world, unquote. UNCTAD estimates about 60% of today's global trade consists of trade in intermediate goods and services, which are then incorporated in the production process of goods and services for final consumption. Another way of looking at this is to say that more than 1/4 of the total stated value of global exports consists of inputs from foreign countries, a figure that has more than doubled since John wrote his article. In recent years, the study of global value chains has become very much the flavor of the month among both economists, political scientists, sociologists, and multilateral economic institutions. It's very rare for me to actually find a subject that's a winner. Usually I look at failed institutions that weren't failing at the time, but managed to fail shortly after I studied them. So global value chains have been a good thing. You see many international reports in the last couple of years. UNCTAD's flagship World Investment Report of last year was devoted to the subject of global value chains. Major reports from the WTO, the World Bank, OECD. But even though global value chains have received increasing attention both in the scholarly literature and in official reports, the actual implications of value chains for multilateral institutions has received very little attention. And in keeping with the theme of this panel, this is what I'm going to try to address briefly today. Part of what I'm doing here draws on a large and long overdue study that I've been doing with Greg Noble and Rick Donor on the automobile industry in East Asia. And I'll come back to that in a little while. Now, there are many ways in which one could cut into this topic, the implications of value chains for multilateral economic institutions, and some I'm going to ignore completely today. One major area, for instance, is one in which John has done a lot of work in the last few years, and that is on corporate social responsibility. I must say I'm much more relaxed on this area, though, than on other dimensions of development, which I'll come back to a bit later on. I'm going to start with something which may seem rather trivial, but I think the importance of this issue has been underestimated, and it's something that needs to have more focus, and that is global value chains and the measurement of trade, GVCs and trade data. Few economic concepts are as intuitive as the balance of trade, or seemingly as easily measured through the collection of data at the border about the value of imports and exports. But the growth of global value chains has cast increasing doubts on the usefulness of conventional measures of international trade for our understanding not just of the real sources of products, but of bilateral trade imbalances, and even the relationship between international trade and domestic welfare. For instance, the OECD has commented that, quote, the fact that exports increasingly embody intermediate inputs sourced from abroad makes it difficult to identify the real contribution a given export may make to an economy's well-being, whether in terms of income or employment, unquote. In a world in which more than a quarter of the value of exports consists of components or services that have been imported, national trade statistics overstate domestically generated value added and lead to a double or multiple counting of the contribution of domestic production to exports, thereby introducing significant distortions into our understanding of the global economy and regional economies. More than 1/4 of the value of global trade is estimated to be double counted. So the global economy is actually substantially less interconnected than is conventionally believed. Moreover, because the openness of economies is normally measured by the ratio of imports and exports to GDP, national trade data have substantially overstated the openness of economies. And given that global value chains still are predominantly focused on regions, then conventional measures of regional integration substantially overestimate the importance of interconnectedness within a region in comparison with the significance of extra-regional interactions. One dimension of the inaccuracy of current trade data has received a great deal of attention, and that is the failure of the data to provide an accurate reflection of bilateral trade imbalances. The best illustration of this has come from a number of well-known studies pioneered by Jason Dedrick and his colleagues on the composition of the various components of Apple products, starting with the iPod, ranging from then the iPhone, the iPad. And all of these have shown that only about $5 of the value of something that is counted as a $300 Chinese export is actually produced within China itself. Now, the assembly of Apple products may represent an extreme example, but aggregate studies suggest that the local contribution, that is local value added in all of China's manufactured exports, is only around 60% of the recorded value. Now, a failure to take into account the real geographical origin of the value of products leads conventional trade data frequently to misstate bilateral imbalances. Making rather heroic assumptions, the WTO estimates that in aggregate, the overall US trade deficit with China would have been cut by more than 40% in 2008 if it had been measured in value-added terms rather than by conventional national trade statistics. So conscious of these problems with conventional trade data, and not least how these misleading data can inflame trade disputes, the WTO and the OECD have collaborated for a number of years on constructing a trade database that reflects the domestic value added in exports. Now, in principle, estimating trade on a value added basis should be straightforward, using input-output data collected according to standards established by the United Nations. In practice, however, the task is formidable. Industry data are often missing or incomplete, with gaps having to be filled through estimation, and for data on value added to be used for purposes of calculating international trade, input-output tables have to be harmonized first at the national and then at the international level. Many developing economies collect such data irregularly. So the effort required to harmonize these data is such that even for advanced industrialized economies, there is a substantial time lag before these data are published. So the OECD database, for instance, last year had data only going up to 2005. So multilateral institutions consequently face a dilemma and a considerable challenge. Existing trade data are increasingly acknowledged to be inaccurate and potentially politically inflammatory. Yet whatever the enthusiasm of national statistical agencies, of some governments and domestic constituencies, the complexities of generating data for trade by value added are such that it's unlikely that we're going to be able to replace these inaccurate data by something better in the near future. The second issue that the paper addresses is the area of investment and whether or not there's a case for a multilateral agreement on investment. In an era in which there have been multiple treaties relating to trade that have facilitated the activities of production networks, a global treaty on investment has been something that is notably missing. Efforts at negotiation of a global investment treaty date back to the Havana Charter, the stillborn International Trade Organization, and from these through the OECD's multilateral agreement on investment, it's been impossible for the international community to reach agreement, to reach consensus on a treaty because of the inability to negotiate a balance between the rights and responsibilities of foreign investors and host countries. Some commentators suggest, well, now everyone is on the same page. Global value chains are in everyone's interests. We need to guarantee foreign investment, make it as certain as possible for investors, and this will benefit everyone. So we should now be able to negotiate a global investment treaty. I'm very skeptical about this. I think that attempting to do this would be not the right direction to go in. And even from the perspective of foreign investors, it's doubtful whether they would get more within a global negotiating context than they can currently get through the multitude of bilateral investment treaties that have been signed in the last 15 years. And would global negotiations make sense from the perspective of host governments? Again, probably not. They've already made concessions on a bilateral basis that would be demanded of them to be multilateralized if there was a global treaty, and in many instances, these treaties provide foreign investors with better standing than domestic investors. Lastly, I focus on global value chains and development, and here I find a huge gap in many of the official reports that have recently been published. There is recognition within these reports that global value chains build on a fundamental asymmetry, power asymmetry, and that for developing countries to gain more from participation in global value chains, then upgrading of domestic capabilities must occur. But what we find in most of these reports is that even though the analysis is quite subtle and recognizes the difficulties of upgrading, in the enthusiasm that the reports demonstrate for encouraging participation in global value chains, the policy recommendations that come down discard much of the subtlety of the analysis and instead come back to what resembles a rather simplistic Washington consensus type argument that developing economies should just liberalize their trade and investment policies, strengthen intellectual property rights, forget about industrial policy, and this will deliver the development goals that they seek. So there's much more here which I can't deal with today. And for me, the key area here that needs to be addressed further is the whole question of development and upgrading of capabilities, and what the international community can do to try to upgrade, to assist in upgrading of local capabilities to enable developing economies to participate more effectively in value chains. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, John. Wasn't there a famous person who once said that all that's solid melts in the air? And I guess that's sort of what we've heard so far, so it's only appropriate that we end with the internet. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm honored to be part of this panel and delighted to offer my views as a lawyer on what I call internet-induced changes in global governance and how this map on to existing institutions at the international level. It is nowadays clear that cyberspace is in fact real space and that it can be regulated. And since the late 90s, up until when most states tended either to ignore online activities or to regulate them rather lightly, we have seen the emergence of a great number of state interventions, and states regulate internet activities in multiple ways. For instance, protection of minors, of privacy, intellectual property rights, enforcement, liability, etc. Some of these policies have been coordinated at the international level, but most of them have not. And quite importantly, there is no single organization at the international level that addresses the multifaceted issues that have been raised by the internet as it has emerged as this global communications platform. Also, while we have seen the emergence of new specialized venues, and here notably I talk about the Internet Corporation for Site Name and Numbers, ICANN, many of the relevant international fora, in fact, stemmed from the pre-Internet age. The literature has covered quite well these newer types of institutions of global Internet governance, such as ICANN, as I mentioned, as well as the Internet Governance Forum, because these fora are particularly intriguing as they do not correspond to these conventional types of international cooperation, but function rather as bottom-up multi-stakeholder bodies, often without state representation and without international organization status under public international law. What is also interesting about these new types of institutions is that they are also fluid, they're in flux. I mean, the US giving up the internet is now all over the press, and in late April we're going to have the Net Mundial meeting in Brazil, where potentially new decisions on the fundamental principles of internet governance and the future of ICANN will be taken. In the literature, of course, we have both a sort of exaggeration about these institutions with regard to grassroots democracy, open representation, and collaboration, but we also have much criticism, a lot of skepticism, which concerns legitimacy, accountability, and participation. Much more rarely analyzed, however, in the literature are the pre-internet organizations that I mentioned, and whether and how they have adapted, especially how they have adapted in parallel, sort of a comparative analysis. And I think this is somewhat odd because the focus on this narrow internet governance institutions addresses, in fact, only the infrastructural issues of the internet. And there are also other, arguably as critically important issues that need to be looked at. Dutton and Pelto call them non-internet-centric issues that encompass a vast range of wider international policy issues such as human rights, cultural and linguistic diversity, intellectual property, digital divide, and critical content regulation questions. I also argue that any potential solution to the narrow IG problem will only marginally affect this whole range of questions or the existing institutional arrangements and the international level that actually govern them. At the same time, it is precisely in these other domains where major controversies unfold, where contestation actually comes from. And it is also in those domains where we have a higher level of legalization. So this is a sort of a mismatch that exists in the literature. In this sense, and so as to follow this adaptation process beyond the narrow internet governance domain, I seek in the paper to examine 3 pre-internet institutions and that tackle actually different clusters of this non-internet-centric issues. So I look at the International Telecommunication Union, at the World Intellectual Property Organization, and at the World Trade Organization, and broadly international trade venues. And I argue that these 3 different fora correspond to different types of reactions to the internet. Resistance in the sense of the ITU, incremental adaptation with regard to WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and as a sort of a creeping advance in the trade venues, sort of a advance through the back door. Because of the little time I have today, I would only talk a little bit about the WTO, since also it is almost absent in the literature. The World Trade Organization is very, very rarely thematized in any of the internet governance discussions in general, which I think is peculiar as it has such pertinence for issues at all layers of the communications model. as it addresses infrastructure as well as applications and content, and it has, of course, highly legalized rules. So I argue that WTO rules combined with the WTO plus rules enshrined in bilateral and regional trade agreements effectively regulate many aspects of this internet-centric and non-internet-centric issues. This happens mainly through a series of preferential trade agreements concluded by the US with a number of partners since 2004, which really create a sort of a digital trade tailored template. And this template has been copied also in non-US preferential trade agreements such as Australia, Singapore, Chile, Australia, and so on. Next to progressive gut-like approach to liberalization in these preferential trade agreements, they also have real regulation beyond the border, in particular tailored to digital trade, and address issues such as privacy, data, and consumer protection, as well as the key IP questions that are raised in a digital environment, mostly with regard to copyright enforcement and intermediaries' liability. Basically, in a sense, adopting the approach of the US Digital Millennium Copyright Act and adjusting the level of protection to it. So just to wrap up, we might go into some details in the discussion afterwards. Overall, I believe there are palpable changes in global governance with the emergence of multi-stakeholder internet governance institutions, but only as we define them narrowly. The internet has caused much less radical changes with regard to conventional international organizations. And this is perhaps understandable, and here I would quote John Ruggie as well. He has predicted, and that was in 1975, in fact, the year that I was born, that there are different tensions that one has to consider. On the one hand, we have the tensions between science as informed by consensual knowledge of cause and effect relations, and on the other hand, we have politics informed by normative purposes, negotiated priorities and capabilities, as well as strong power dependencies in the international community and tendencies to adhere to conventional type of governance approaches. And here it is very easy sort of to agree with the realists in the field, with Dresner, Goldsmith and others, who have argued that we have plainly seen the return of the state, and national sovereignty and power matter in a straightforward manner in real as well as in cyberspace. And here it is interesting, perhaps we can talk about this afterwards, that states have also adopted sort of a new unilateral governance tools because they regulate through technologies and through code, and we see this now very well. Beyond this sort of realist approach, I rather share actually Yochai Benkler's concern that a system with imperfectly defined relations between local and global, private and public regulatory processes, and between unilateralism and harmonization presents an institutional environment that is particularly ripe for picking by non-representative commercial and other organizations to embed their values in the regulatory system that will ultimately emerge, that will come into being. And I think clearly in this field there is a need for more research and more sort of comprehensive research, because it is still striking that matters are analyzed in silos, both in policy and in academia, and that the regulatory spillovers and interdependencies are largely ignored. And just to wrap up, I would like to hear the opinion of the panel as well as of the audience, perhaps. what do you think about the role of external shocks to these international regimes that are emerging with regard to the internet? Because we have seen that shocks like the 9/11 and the Snowden revelations clearly play a role in adjusting the system in new ways. So maybe we can talk about this afterwards. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mira, for your presentation and for the reminder. So, Mark, you now have the easy task of telling us what we now know about innovation and adaptation of multilateral institutions in a new geopolitical era that we didn't know before. Thank you, Mark.
So before I got here today, I hadn't planned to try to unify these papers for a couple of reasons. First, I actually didn't have all of the papers before today, and second, they are extremely different. But given John's dictum, I will do my best. So here's what I've come up with, and after that, I will give some brief additional comments to each paper. I have written comments for all of you as well. So I think what we now know, and whether or not we didn't know this before, I'm not sure, but we clearly have a more complex system that we live in. And I think all of these papers address the question of complexity, at least implicitly, some of them explicitly. We also have a system that is currently undergoing a great deal of disruption. And this is a term that's used in the internet field, and my role at CIGI looks at internet governance issues, so this is something I've thought about. But while the internet governance community tends to think of the internet as uniquely disruptive, as a political scientist, I'm always reminded of Joseph Schumpeter and the notion of creative destruction, and this really isn't an entirely new thing. So this more complex system that's currently undergoing a lot of disruption is more tightly connected than before, involves more actors and more actor types, crucially, than previously, and is currently governing more of human life. Less of governance is accomplished at the state and local level. More of it is increasingly international and global in character, or at least regional. So the question in my mind is, what's producing this state of affairs? How have we gotten here? Where are we going? And what can we do about it? It's clearly, in part, at least a function of technology. I think that's what these papers tell us. Mira's paper very clearly talking about the internet and the changes that technology has had on other international institutions that aren't directly connected to the internet. But it's also a function of technology in that technology has brought us closer together, which in some ways makes us more vulnerable to things like global health crises. Technology has allowed the tighter interconnection of global financial systems and, as John Ravenhill points out, global production. So in this sense, then, technology is a key driver of the difficulties that we are confronted when we try and do governance in a more innovative way. But it's not simply a function of technology, or at least not simply a function of material technology. It strikes me that our conception of technology is very truncated. We tend to focus on technology as things, so the smartphones and the tablets that all of us carry are technology. But we also have a category of social technology that we don't study as a sort of self-consciously identified class of phenomena in that way. So in this sense, what I mean is that the rule of law is a social technology. Markets are a social technology. Democracy is a social technology. Our stock of such social technology has changed over time as people have thought about new organizational forms, experimented with them, instantiated them, rejected them, contested them, and done politics and done global governance. So this is, in a sense, connected to also something that I've done other work on, which is the evolution of what I've taken to calling the procedural architecture of the international system. So to come up with all of these rules, these social forms for governing human life, we need practices of rulemaking. And this is, in a sense, what politics is largely concerned with. And in this sphere, in the international system, our practices of rulemaking have changed, and John Ruggie's work has been instrumental to understanding them better. He has told us, for instance, that multilateralism is more than having multiple parties. It has thick, substantive content in terms of norms of how to proceed. We also have other procedural practices for rulemaking in the international system. Great power symmetry comes easily to mind and is dealt with in some of these papers. International law, including soft law, is also at the forefront of current developments in how we do rulemaking. So this procedural architecture of the international system is what helps us ensure that policy catches up to technology at the global level. And that is in some ways the central challenge, or one of the central challenges of global governance at the moment. But a focus on the procedural architecture of the international system can also alert us to a potential danger sign. We may be running up against the limits of the ability of the procedural architecture of the international system to function. And that limiting factor, I would argue, is a product of cultural diversity. The procedural architecture of the international system for the last roughly 400-odd years has been European in origin, and that has been spreading globally with the European state system. And while that sort of ideational material has been injected into non-Western societies, that injection did not displace what came before. There are distinctive non-Western cultures and traditions of rulemaking and rule interpretation that remain latent, and as non-Western societies grow in power and capability, may be likely to reassert themselves. And if they do, that may interfere not only with our ability to reach new agreements, because we don't agree on the legitimate procedures for rulemaking, it may also interfere with our ability to operate existing rule systems, because those rule systems depend on the ability for general rules to be applied to novel particular cases according to legitimate procedures. And if we lack those legitimate procedures, we may run into procedural deadlock. And internet governance is an excellent example of just such a phenomenon. At the World Conference on International Telecommunication in December 2012, we had a procedural deadlock. And that procedural deadlock has complicated the diplomacy around internet governance since. So that is a little bit of where I think these papers take us, as well as some of my own thoughts. And I'll now turn just to some sort of individual comments. John, how much longer do I have?
About 3 minutes.
Okay, then what I propose to do is cut myself short and distribute my written comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you so much. This was a terrific, spontaneous summary and synthesis for which I congratulate you. The floor is now open. We've had some just fascinating paper presentations which address very different subjects, but as Mark has just indicated, really are part and parcel of a broader social and institutional disruption through which we're living. Please, the mic is here. Tell us who you are.
I'm Ray Kozlowski from the University at Albany, and I've got a question for our first two paper givers, Mikhail and Fen. Are collective conflict management mechanisms optimal for countries that are too weak to lead, yet too strong to follow? And if so, to what extent are the BRICS actually using these mechanisms to address conflicts, whether in their regions or amongst themselves?
Let's take a couple or 2, 3 questions at the same time and then come back, please.
Thank you. I'm Lorraine Elliott from the Australian National University. I want to ask a slightly different question. It's a question of scale. And I understand that the purpose of the panel was really to look at the adaptation of multilateral institutions in a new geopolitical area. But we govern for a purpose and we govern for some people. And we often govern for those who are most marginalised and least able to hear. So I've been really interested to hear the way in which we've talked about the way in which rule-making may now be different. Even rule-taking may be different. But what about those who are affected by the rules? Have the kinds of changes that you've been talking about actually led to any different kinds of outcomes for those who are most affected by the rules of global governance?
Wow, that was a small question. Give you all a minute to think about it. Let's take one more. Yes.
Hi, I'm Greg Noble of the University of Tokyo. Thanks for an interesting panel. I have a question about the World Bank. The assumption in the paper is that the World Bank is the primary institution dealing with developing countries in the face of high risk. But obviously the World Bank operates, in a larger market context in which it's not the only bank. So I guess the central question as I looked at your graph was, to what extent does this reflect the decline of the World Bank's ability or willingness to provide risk financing? And to what extent does it reflect the stepping up of project financing and other types of supply by international banking institutions on the private side? Thanks.
Great. Let's begin with the security questions. Mikhail, do you want to start or Sven? Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Oh, do we need a mic? Will this reach down there? I'm not sure.
As far as I understood, your question was about whether the BRICS are abusing multilateral conflict management mechanisms by being obstructive, so to say, by defying collective action to address security issues in a variety of regions. Yeah, you might call that abusing in terms of obstructing activism, in terms of obstructing kind of positive action that might be meant to bring, absolute benefits to the parties on the ground and to the international community as a whole and to the region where conflict is happening. But I think that BRICS still have often have their distinct vision of what has to be done in each particular conflict, and they have, at least until a certain point, if you take Russia, been quite vocal and sometimes even convincing when they were trying to explain what should be done in Syria, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, and so forth. They were quite transparent about laying out the benefits and the problems of potential solutions, and they were quite consistent in criticizing the methods that other members of international communities have been trying to apply. So I would say yes, BRICS, and especially if we take Russia and China and sometimes even India, they are the nations that care most about conflict management issues. They do defy homogeneous approaches to conflict management in the same way they defy firm alliance commitments and firm rules of engagement on whatever security issues. They want to preserve freedom of maneuver. Whether you can call that obstructionism, yes, sometimes. I think they are more inclined to hold back and wait until a solution crystallizes, then get in immediately and do something about that, which may ultimately lead to a worse situation than where the conflict actually started. So they just simply, I guess the bottom line here that they simply do not want to approach all conflicts in a similar way. They have a vision, or they have suggestions about what to do in each case. Sure, yes.
Great idea. You can tell you have practical experience.
So if I interpret the question correctly, are the BRICS sometimes parties to CCM, Collective Conflict Management Ventures? And the answer is yes, sometimes. The Chinese have certainly been involved, contributing naval assets to dealing with the piracy problem off Somalia. Brazil, if you sort of look at CCM interventions in Haiti, it has again been a significant player. A CCM venture that has consistently stalled in its tracks, led by the OSCE in Moldova. Russia's been the spoiler. It's been a party, but it's been a spoiler. CCM doesn't always work. I mean, it's an innovation, but it sometimes it just, CCM spins wheels, doesn't always succeed. I think if you obviously look at deadlock in the UN as one of the reasons why we have these sort of hybrid forms of cooperation to circumvent collective security responses by the United Nations Security Council. Obviously, Russia and China are spoilers there. And I think, if you can't lead, if you're too weak to lead and too strong to follow, your frustration curve goes up and you become a spoiler.
Thank you. James, do you want to take a crack at the question about is this helping people who actually are the most vulnerable and marginalized?
Sure. Yeah, so I think, at least in the area that I know something about, global health, or global public health, the kind of reforms that in the first instance have taken place since the end of the Cold War have in fact had major effects on better health outcomes. I would not contest that, but I do contest, I would say that the degree to which what could have been achieved was not achieved is an indicator of a massive and egregious failure. And I would also argue that in now the post-international financial crisis world that we live in, those failures are even more egregious and even more marked. And just to kind of give you just a thumbnail, we're 7 billion on the planet. 1 billion go to bed hungry every single night. 1.3 billion people are underemployed or unemployed. Of those people, a very significant percentage, 67% of all employed people in sub-Saharan Africa live on less than $2 a day, and on and on and on and on. And the largest and most significant driver of health inequity are in fact the societal determinants of health, and these are political and economic and they're structural. So the changes that are proposed largely by, that are outlined in the Lancet Commission are driven not just by a how to improve governance or what should we do to improve governance, but primarily by why. It is very much focused on overcoming these egregious inequities. But it's also very realistic in the sense that we live in a world where there is an architecture, and that architecture, however in flux it is and however stressed it is by the many and myriad factors that are discussed here at this table, there is still an architecture. And it can be altered, but you must work with that architecture. And so the changes that they, or the proposals that they have made, which I actually agree with almost entirely, I think are a concrete, realistic, and pragmatic way to go forward. And I'm always open, and as we all are, to shocks, to surprises. They do happen. I could give you many examples of that, but I think your question is absolutely the right question. So.
Thank you. Domenico, as I understood, Greg Noble's question was, has the ecosystem changed so much for various banking functions related to development that sort of help explain why the World Bank is doing or has done what it's doing?
Yeah, this is in partly certainly true, but I think the World Bank shouldn't be a substitute for the private sector. In other words, it's true that competition has become more intensive in this sort of industry, but what we try to argue is that there's also been a lack of responsiveness by the World Bank, and one of the main reasons for that is essentially its risk management practices. They do have distributional consequences, and they are not neutral. And in particular, we have tried to highlight sort of institutional capture by the staff of the institution itself, by major shareholders, that essentially tend to redistribute risks away from, from the institution onto, and from major shareholders onto the borrowers. And I think that it is this subsequent lack of responsiveness that at the very least is escalating the trend that is very clear from the first slide, one of the first slides I showed in my presentation. Thank you.
Great, let's take another round of questions. Please.
Larry Crump from Griffith University in Australia. I have a question for the paper related to the internet. And I appreciated that you looked carefully at the WTO and WIPO and the International Telecommunications Union. But I was curious and I was surprised that you didn't talk about ICANN, who handles the domain names, and the RIRs, the regional internet registries, which of course distribute IP addresses. It seemed to me that a paper looking at multilateralism would have to talk about those organizations as well. And so I just wondered, do they appear in your paper, or what are you going to do with all that? Thank you.
Thanks. You had a question?
My name's Matt Castle from McGill. Thanks to all the panelists. My question was also about the internet regulation. You mentioned that the US is at the forefront of including regulatory measures in PTAs, and that this has been taken up by other countries, including Australia. And I'm wondering whether this is a process of diffusion that you're talking about, and if so, what is driving it? Is this, where's the demand for other countries to do it? Thanks.
Andy.
Andy Knight, University of Alberta, and also University of West Indies now in Trinidad. I just wonder if we are not missing some elements of adaptation and change within the multilateral system by focusing so heavily on the global and not on some regional adaptations that are happening. And one of the questions I had was for James, because I think in the area of NDCs, for example, the Port of Spain Declaration, which was a sort of a unique measure by CARICOM in order to be able to try to deal with the problems of non-communicable diseases, is something that we should look at and see whether or not that can be applicable across regions and maybe scale up to the globe.
Okay, let me hand this down to Mira and then to James.
Whoops. Thanks very much for the questions. On ICANN, I had the feeling that there is so much written about ICANN, really, and it only then concentrates on ICANN, how it functions, the new models, and there is criticism, as I said, and some positive feedback as well. And I tried actually deliberately to look at pre-internet institutions, to look how they have adapted. Of course, ICANN is central to internet governance and to this infrastructural layer. But I thought that would be a repetition of literature that exists already, and especially now when we have the discussion of what the future of ICANN may be, post-Net Mondial and so on. There are really a host of new papers that describe this really in detail, and I thought I spare this and add some value through a different channel. And I also think it's quite important what I mentioned, that the talk is only about ICANN and the rest is really often forgotten. There is not this connecting of all the dots, all the organizations that actually matter for internet regulation. Even with regard to telecom, for instance, the talk is often about the contestation between ITU and ICANN, because this played out in reality. But in fact, the WTO has much more detailed rules on telecommunication services and networks than the ITU that really matter also for internet regulation. And this is often just left out. So I thought this would be the way I would add some value. But yes, you're quite right. And about diffusion, yes, there is. I'm a lawyer, so I would not go into all the details about diffusion. But I think with PTAs, it is often the case that just templates are copied. I mean, really just the template is taken and copied. And this is in particular so with regard to copyright enforcement, intellectual property enforcement broadly, also because it is an implementation of the WIPO Internet Treaty. So this is a sort of an easy way, and what is happening is a sort of a harmonization, TRIPS Plus and WIPO Plus harmonization at the international level. And there are some studies that show how the US makes lesser concessions the less the GDP of the countries, of the partner countries. So it's quite nicely, one can follow really these concessions. And with Australia has been following the US example for a long time. And this is now also a sort of an avenue into moving into this mega regionals, you know, with the TPP and the TTIP. We're going to see perhaps maybe some new rules, some change of those templates, or something on top of the templates.
So that's a great question, Andy. There's no question that CARICOM has been highly influential in pushing an agenda around non-communicable diseases. So diabetes, obesity, heart disease, cardiovascular disease, and osteoarthritis and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Those are the most common. So CARICOM has been highly, highly instrumental in bringing that agenda to PAHO and also in bringing that agenda to the United Nations. And they've also been highly influential in the September 2011 summit on non-communicable diseases in New York. In fact, they essentially, and John Curtin has just left, but John and I worked with CARICOM a number of years ago to actually help them formulate their strategy for that. So they have had huge impact. But I would also point to a couple of other examples that I think are much more material. I would argue that the CARICOM initiative has been really from the local to the global with an intention of influencing a global framework. There are other innovations that I think are very much worth looking at, and particularly around health systems. I'm involved in the southern region of Africa, and particularly in Malawi, with a major initiative where we have 200,000 people who are infected with HIV on treatment for AIDS in Malawi, in one country alone. And that program is one of the most effective, efficient healthcare delivery programs in the world. And we do that through healthcare workers who have a grade 9 education and who are trained in scientifically valid clinical algorithms. And we use health informatics and health data management systems to ensure the best possible point of care delivery around the diagnosis, the management, and the treatment of HIV. And we have taken that program now and expanded a broader primary health care agenda using that system. And we're expanding now into maternal child health, malaria, disease surveillance, and a whole bunch of other areas. And now, because that program is so successful, we're starting a collaborative research agenda with Aboriginal communities here in Canada to use some of the lessons learned and the systems that we've learned to improve healthcare in rural and remote regions of this country. And I would argue that some of the major challenges that we face in healthcare and healthcare delivery in the north, largely financial, are actually remediable through the kind of things that have been developed in the south and the kind of example that I've given you. And there are other examples around, for example, disaster preparedness and early warning in relationship to climate change. In Africa, disaster preparedness and early warning systems are far advanced, and their food security systems, their drought early warning systems are incredibly advanced in terms of creating systems that actually respond to real community needs and that build real community resilience and capacity. And so those are just some examples of things that are happening regionally in different parts of the world that have enormous significance for global and multilateral initiatives. So.
Thank you. We got time for one other round of questions, if there are any. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm from McMaster University. I'm an undergraduate student. My question was directed towards Dr. Orbinski. So you mentioned the need for a platform for multi-stakeholder collaboration. I was wondering about what this would technically look like. So were we looking at reforming an old institution and adding new players to it? Did we want to create a new one? And if we were to involve non-state actors in this institution, what would their involvement look like in terms of decision-making and influence? Thank you.
Any others? The panelists want to add any questions to one another? Okay. James?
I'd like to ask you if you've heard anything.
So essentially what is proposed is that a new multi-stakeholder platform on governance for health be created. Now, one of the great challenges in health, and it's clear that this is a similar challenge in other domains, whether it's internet governance, finance, trade, a whole range of particular applications. One of the great challenges is that there's highly specific technical knowledge that is specific to the domain, to the area that is under scrutiny or under study or under policy review. And at the same time, simultaneously, there's a political process around the decision, which really is a decision around who gets what, when, and how. That's ultimately what, to me anyway, politics is about. So somehow marrying those two, or creating a circumstance where the technical knowledge that's specific to the application can interact with the politics of policy, that's always a challenge. So that has been a particular challenge in health and in its various applications, whether it's diagnostics, vaccines, drug development, health systems, informatics, whatever. So by creating a multi-stakeholder platform in the first instance to allow for that kind of communication and where policy issues can be worked through, that's one of the primary objectives. The other objective is that you bring in multiple stakeholders and that you do so in a manner that is framed primarily and in the first instance around health equity for all, right? So that whatever proposal whatever solution you come up with, it must meet that primary parameter of advancing health equity. So a stakeholder platform structured and designed with that intent is fundamentally different, in fact, from what exists now in the international architecture. And then the other, an independent scientific monitoring panel, which would be mandated to look at health equity impact assessments across international organizations. That also would again, realistically push other institutions to incorporate health equity into their policy planning. So that, for example, when you're looking at energy policy, well, what energy policy has the best health equity outcome? Well, it's different in different circumstances. Are you going to go nuclear? Are you going to go for solar? Are you going to go for coal? Are you going to go for whatever? It depends on your circumstance from a health equity perspective. And there are also very different outcomes in terms of the impact of those particular energy strategies on direct health outcomes. So by introducing a health equity assessment into policy planning across institutions and across policy domains, you immediately maximize the potential for impacting overall health impact. And then finally, the idea of strengthening the use of existing systems, human rights systems, for example, special rapporteurs, and so on, and strengthening the use of sanctions when there are violations of law or practice that decrease health equity. Those are very concrete and very specific uses of existing systems that can very quickly improve overall health equity practice.
Well, thank you, James, and thank you to the panel for a set of fascinating papers and presentations, for being disciplined and sticking to the time target. Please join me in also thanking our commentator for his brilliant synthesis at the end. Please join me in thanking them all.